I learned the complete truth from sanctioned psyker Joanna Kess during our third week in the conditioning facility. She had managed to piece together our actual purpose from conversations she had overheard between tech priests who assumed her loyalty implants prevented her from understanding the significance of their words. What she told me in whispers barely audible above the ventilation systems shattered whatever remained of my faith in the benevolent nature of Imperial service. The Golden Throne, she explained, was not simply the life support system that kept the Emperor's physical form functional. It was a psychic amplification device of incomprehensible complexity, designed during the dark age of technology to channel and focus psychic energy on a scale that could affect the entire galaxy. The device had been constructed using principles that modern tech priests could barely comprehend, incorporating technologies that blurred the line between science and sorcery. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed Imperial ships to navigate the warp safely, required constant feeding to maintain its strength. Without that beacon, humanity's interstellar empire would collapse within months, as ships would be unable to navigate the chaotic currents of the warp. Trade would cease, communication would become impossible, and humanity's scattered worlds would be left defenseless against the myriad threats that lurked in the darkness between stars. Every day, 1,000 psychers were fed into the throne's mechanisms. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, their life force drained over hours, while their souls were shredded and reformed into psychic energy that could be channeled through the Emperor's own consciousness. The process was designed to extract every possible joule of energy from each sacrifice, ensuring that nothing was wasted in humanity's desperate struggle for survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Kess told me about the selection criteria. We weren't chosen randomly, or even based purely on psychic strength. We were chosen because our psychic signatures indicated maximum compatibility with the throne's extraction mechanisms. Tests performed over 10 millennia had identified specific genetic markers and psychic resonance patterns that indicated a person would remain conscious throughout the entire draining process, experiencing every moment of their dissolution with perfect clarity. The Adeptus Mechanicus had discovered that conscious suffering generated more usable psychic energy than unconscious death. The screams we heard every night weren't the byproduct of the process, they were its primary function. Pain, terror, and despair were the raw materials from which the Emperor's psychic beacon was constructed, and we had been specifically selected because we would provide the highest quality of those materials. Every one of us in that facility had been specifically selected because we would feel every second of what was going to happen to us. Our consciousness would remain intact as our life force was slowly drained, our awareness crystal clear as our souls were torn apart and fissured. What it means to be sacrificed to the Emperor in Warhammer 40. And they tell you it's an honor, the greatest blessing a mortal soul can receive in this galaxy of endless darkness. To give your life force, your very essence, to sustain the God Emperor of mankind in his eternal vigil upon the Golden Throne. They tell you that your sacrifice will help maintain the Astronomicon, that beacon of hope that guides Imperial ships through the hellish storms of the warp. They tell you that you'll join the Emperor's eternal choir, singing hymns of devotion that will echo through the ages. They tell you many things when they come to take you. What they don't tell you is what it actually feels like to die that way. What they don't tell you is that your consciousness doesn't simply fade into peaceful oblivion, welcomed into the Emperor's eternal embrace. What they don't tell you is that the choir is literally composed of screaming souls in eternal agony, that every single day, for 10 millennia, 1,000 souls have experienced what I experienced, and that their screams still echo through the psychic realm like a chorus of the damned. What they don't tell you is that the selection process isn't random, or based on honor, or even purely on psychic strength. What they don't tell you is that you're chosen specifically because you'll remain conscious throughout the entire process, experiencing every moment of your dissolution with perfect, inescapable clarity. What they don't tell you is that this isn't accidental, it's by design, because conscious suffering generates more usable psychic energy than peaceful death. What they don't tell you is that the Emperor knows. He knows what happens to each of us, feels every moment of our agony as if it were his own, and continues the process because the alternative is humanity's extinction. What they don't tell you is that compassion is a luxury the God Emperor of mankind cannot afford. My name was Lexiconum Tertius Valdris, and I was chosen to be one of the 1,000 souls fed to the Golden Throne. This is what it means to be sacrificed to the Emperor, not just to die for him, but to suffer eternally so that humanity might survive another day in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to devour us all. I was born on Valdris Prime, a shrine world where every breath of air carried the scent of sacred incense and every stone had been consecrated with the blood of martyrs. The planet existed for one purpose, to produce faithful servants of the Emperor, and I was the product of 30 generations of selective breeding programs designed to create psykers with maximum devotional capacity. My bloodline had been carefully curated by the Adeptus Ministorum, each marriage arranged to enhance psychic potential while maintaining absolute faith in the Imperial creed. My earliest memory is of my grandmother, Palatine Superior Valdris the Twice Blessed, kneeling before our family shrine as she recited the 777 sacred devotions. She had served as a battle sister for 60 years before retiring to oversee our family's spiritual development, and her body bore the sacred scars of a dozen campaigns against the enemies of mankind. Every evening, she would gather the family's children around the shrine and tell us stories of her battles. Not tales of glory and conquest, but accounts of the price that service to the Emperor demanded. Pain is the currency of faith, she would tell us, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on each child in turn. The Emperor asks nothing of us that he has not already given himself. Every drop of blood we shed, every moment of suffering we endure is but a pale reflection of his eternal sacrifice for humanity. I understood, even as a child, that I existed for one purpose, to serve the God Emperor of mankind with every fiber of my being. My parents were administratum clerks, third-generation bureaucrats, whose greatest pride was maintaining the accuracy of tithe records that would eventually find their way to Holy Terra. They had been selected for each other by the Ministorum's breeding coordinators, their genetic compatibility assessed through tests that examined everything from psychic resonance to susceptibility to chaos corruption. They named me for the shrine world itself, marking me from birth as property of the Imperium. Tertius indicated that I was the third son, though my older brothers had been claimed by different branches of Imperial service. Marcus Secundus had shown aptitude for strategic thinking and was inducted into the Schola Progenium, while Julius Primus had demonstrated physical perfection and was selected for the Stormtroopers. I was the psychic one, the mutation that ran through our family line like a blessing and a curse. My abilities manifested early, beginning with prophetic dreams that proved disturbingly accurate. At age 4, I dreamed of a fire that would consume the shrine dedicated to Saint Sabbat 3 days before it actually happened, caused by a servitor malfunction that no one could have predicted. At age 5, I accurately predicted the arrival of an inquisitorial delegation that was conducting surprise inspections of Shrine World compliance. By age 6, the local ecclesiarch had declared me touched by the Emperor's divine sight and begun special training to help me control and channel my emerging abilities. But it was the incident when I was 7 that changed everything. During morning prayers at the Cathedral of Eternal Vigilance, I experienced what the priests called a divine vision. In the middle of reciting the litany of devotion, I began speaking in a voice that wasn't my own, delivering a prophecy about xenos raiders who would attack our sister world of Valdris Secundus within the next solar month. The words that came from my mouth described strategic details no child could possibly know, fleet compositions, attack vectors, even the names of specific enemy commanders. When the Orc War struck Valdris Secundus exactly as I had predicted, killing 3 million Imperial citizens before being repelled, the ecclesiarch sent immediate notification to the Scholastica Psychona. A black ship arrived within weeks, its sanctioned psyker examining me with instruments that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The detection was instantaneous. The moment her psychic probe touched my mind, she recoiled as if struck, her augmetic third eye smoking from the brief contact with my untrained abilities. I possessed what they classified as theta-level psychic potential, strong enough to be useful but not so overwhelming as to require immediate execution or soul binding. More importantly, my abilities showed the specific resonance patterns that indicated what they called sacrificial compatibility, though I wouldn't understand what that meant until much later. The goodbye with my family was brief and formal. My parents understood that psychic children belonged to the Imperium, not to their birth families. My grandmother gave me her personal copy of the Imperial Creed, its pages worn soft from decades of daily reading, and told me that no matter what trials I faced, I should remember that suffering was service, and service was the highest form of love. I didn't understand then that she was trying to prepare me for my eventual fate. The next decade of my life was spent in the Scholastica Psychana's training facilities on Luna, learning to channel and control the energies that flowed through me like molten metal through my veins. The facilities were a maze of reinforced chambers buried deep within Luna's surface, their walls inscribed with psychic dampening runes that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. Every surface was designed to contain or channel psychic energy, creating an environment where even the strongest psychers could be safely trained without risking demonic incursion. They taught me the 5 fundamental disciplines, the basic mental exercises that allow a psyker to maintain control over their abilities. Precognition, to glimpse possible futures. Telepathy, to communicate across vast distances. Divination, to perceive hidden truths. Biomancy, to manipulate living tissue. And pyromancy, the most dangerous discipline, which allowed direct manipulation of the warp's raw energy. Each discipline required years of study and constant practice, with failure often resulting in injury or death for both the student and their instructors. More importantly, they taught me to fear what I was. Every lesson came with stories of untrained psychers who had opened doorways to the warp and allowed demons to pour through, consuming entire star systems in their hunger for mortal souls. We studied the Astropath Wars when a corrupted psyker on Belial 4 had channeled chaotic energies through the planet's astropathic choir, turning every telepath in the system into a gateway for demonic invasion. We learned about the Howling when an entire training facility had been consumed by warp entities after a student's meditation went wrong, leaving nothing but psychic echoes that still screamed warnings to anyone foolish enough to listen. The instructors themselves were living reminders of the price of psychic ability. Sanctioned psychers whose soul binding had left them blind, but granted them supernatural perception. Astropaths whose mental modifications allowed them to survive communication through the warp, but reduced their lifespans to mere decades. Even the facility's servo skulls had been crafted from the remains of psychers who had failed their training, their skulls inscribed with containment runes and fitted with auspex systems that could detect the slightest psychic disturbance. But there were rewards for those who excelled. Advanced students were allowed access to the facility's library, which contained texts on psychic theory that dated back to the dark age of technology. We studied the works of the Emperor himself, though most of his writings were so heavily redacted that only fragments remained comprehensible. We learned about the history of humanity's psychic evolution, the gradual emergence of mental abilities that marked our species' next step in development. I excelled in my studies, demonstrating particular aptitude for divination and astropathic communication. My prophetic abilities grew stronger under proper training, allowing me to perceive not just immediate future events, but complex probability chains that extended months or even years ahead. My instructors spoke of a bright future serving the Imperium as an astropath, perhaps even earning assignment to an Astartes chapter or an inquisitorial retinue. Master Astropath Cornelius Vex, the facility's senior instructor, took a particular interest in my development. He had served for over 2 centuries, his body modified with so many psychic enhancement implants that he barely resembled a baseline human. During private lessons, he would share insights about the nature of psychic ability that went far beyond the standard curriculum. Power, he would tell me, his voice speaking directly into my mind while his physical form remained motionless, is not about the strength of your abilities. It is about understanding your place in the greater pattern. The Emperor sees all possible futures simultaneously, and it is our role to help him navigate the paths that lead to humanity's survival. He taught me advanced techniques that weren't part of the standard training, methods for extending my consciousness across vast distances, ways to perceive the underlying currents of probability that shaped galactic events. Under his guidance, I learned to see beyond individual futures and glimpse the grand tapestry of cause and effect that determined the fate of entire civilizations. I allowed myself to dream of glory, of using my abilities to serve the Emperor in ways that would echo through Imperial history. Perhaps I would become an astropath transcendent, my consciousness expanded to perceive threats across entire sectors. Perhaps I would join an Inquisitor's retinue, using my divination abilities to track down heretics and xenos infiltrators. Perhaps I would even earn assignment to one of the great fortress monasteries, helping Space Marine chapters coordinate their campaigns against the enemies of mankind. Those dreams died on my 18th birthday, when Magos Dominus Keth Vox of the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived at the Scholastica Psychana with requisition orders bearing the seal of the High Lords of Terror themselves. The orders were simple. He was to select 1,000 psychically gifted individuals from across the Scholastica's facilities for immediate transfer to Holy Terra. The reason for the transfer was classified beyond my clearance level, but whispered rumors among the other psychers spoke of a great honor, a chance to serve the Emperor more directly than any of us had dared imagine. The selection criteria were specific and mysterious, not just psychic strength, but particular genetic markers, specific resonance patterns, and what the requisition orders termed sacrificial compatibility indices. Magos Dominus Kethvox himself was a figure that seemed to have stepped from the darkest myths of the Omnissiah's servants. More machine than man, his original form had been so extensively modified that only fragments of biological tissue remained visible beneath layers of mechanical augmentation. His head had been replaced with a sophisticated cogitator array, his eyes substituted with optical sensors that could perceive across 17 different spectrums simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice was a harmonic blend of vox synthesizers and binary cant that made the air itself vibrate with barely contained energy. He moved through the Scholastica's facilities like a predator evaluating livestock, his auger arrays scanning each potential candidate with instruments that penetrated flesh, bone, and spirit itself. When those sensors focused on me during the selection process, I felt something I had never experienced before. A complete and total examination that left no aspect of my being hidden. The tech priest's scanners didn't just measure my psychic output. They mapped every neural pathway, cataloged every genetic sequence, and somehow evaluated qualities that had no name in standard Imperial Gothic. The selection process took 3 days. Thousands of psychers were examined, but only those who met the precise specifications were chosen. I watched as friends and fellow students were passed over despite possessing greater raw power than I did, while others with seemingly modest abilities were immediately marked for inclusion. The criteria weren't based on strength or skill. They were based on something far more specific and disturbing. I was selected along with 999 others, a mixture of astropaths, sanctioned psychers, and even a few unsanctioned individuals who had been captured more recently. We ranged in age from 16 to 40, representing dozens of worlds and every conceivable variation of psychic ability. What we had in common wasn't our power levels or our training. It was something in our genetic structure, something in the resonance of our souls that made us perfect candidates for whatever awaited us on Terra. What I learned later, from conversations with other selected psychers, was that we all shared certain characteristics that weren't immediately obvious. We all possessed unusually high levels of neural plasticity, allowing our consciousness to remain coherent under extreme psychic stress. We all showed specific genetic markers that indicated resistance to shock-induced unconsciousness. Most significantly, we all demonstrated what the Mechanicus termed consciousness persistence under dissolution, the ability to maintain awareness even while our life force was being systematically drained. We were being selected not for our strength, but for our ability to suffer consciously and completely. The revelation came from Lexicanum Joanna Kess, a woman in her 30s who had served aboard Inquisitor Castigan's retinue for over a decade. Kess had been selected not for her psychic abilities, which were modest compared to many of us, but because she possessed detailed knowledge of heretical cults that the Inquisition wanted to extract before her termination. She had also served as a liaison with Mechanicus tech priests during her career, giving her insights into their evaluation methods that most of us lacked. During the selection process, she had overheard binary Kant conversations between Kethvox and his subordinates that revealed the true nature of the criteria being used. The Magos Dominus wasn't just looking for psychers. He was looking for psychers whose consciousness would remain intact during what the Mechanicus termed essence extraction procedures. The technical discussions she had overheard spoke of optimal suffering duration, consciousness persistence thresholds, and psychic energy extraction efficiency rates. We weren't being chosen to serve the Emperor. We were being chosen to fuel him. The journey to Terra took 3 months aboard the fortress ship Eternal Vigilance, a massive Mechanicus vessel that had been specifically modified for transporting psychic cargo. The ship itself was a masterwork of containment technology, its hull inscribed with suppression runes and fitted with Geller field generators powerful enough to create multiple layers of warp protection. Every corridor was lined with psychic dampening materials that made accessing our abilities impossible, while servo skulls equipped with neural inhibitor arrays patrolled constantly to prevent any attempt at escape or communication. We were housed in individual chambers, each one a masterwork of psychic suppression technology designed to prevent us from accessing our abilities or communicating with each other through mental links. The cells were exactly 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters, large enough to allow basic movement but small enough to prevent any sense of comfort or privacy. The walls were inscribed with containment runes that had been etched by master artificers, their geometric patterns designed to channel and dissipate psychic energy before it could build to dangerous levels. But the isolation was the most effective control mechanism. Each cell was equipped with white noise generators that prevented communication through sound, while psychic dampeners made mental contact impossible. We were alone with our thoughts, cut off from human contact except for the daily visits from tech priests who monitored our physical and mental condition with an attention to detail that was both caring and deeply unsettling. They fed us well during that journey. Nutritional paste enhanced with proteins and vitamins, supplemental injections to maintain optimal health, even mild recreational drugs to keep our stress levels manageable. The meals were perfectly calibrated to maintain our bodies in peak condition, not the simple sustenance provided to normal Imperial citizens, but carefully crafted nutrition designed to optimize our value as psychic resources. At the time, I thought it was evidence of how valuable we were to the Imperium. The quality of our treatment suggested that we were being prepared for positions of honor and responsibility, that our comfort during transport was a small preview of the elevated status that awaited us on Terra. Looking back, I understand that they were simply maintaining livestock. You don't feed a grox poorly before you slaughter it, and you don't allow psychic batteries to deteriorate before harvesting their energy. The ship's crew treated us with a mixture of respect and fear that I initially interpreted as recognition of our future importance. Tech priests would bow their heads when entering our cells, muttering prayers in binary Kent that seemed to honor our sacrifice. Servitors would genuflect before delivering our meals, their programmed behaviors suggesting that we were being treated as sacred objects rather than mere prisoners. Only later did I realize that the respect was genuine, but not for the reasons I had assumed. They honored us, not as future servants of the Emperor, but as offerings to him. We were sacred in the same way that sacrificial animals were sacred in ancient Terra's religious traditions, valuable not for what we would accomplish, but for what we would give up. During the journey, I had time to observe my fellow passengers and piece together additional details about our selection. The age range wasn't random. Everyone selected was old enough to have fully developed psychic abilities, but young enough to have decades of life force available for extraction. The genetic diversity suggested that different types of psychic energy were needed for whatever process awaited us, with each individual chosen to provide a specific component of a larger whole. More disturbing was the realization that many of my fellow selectees showed signs of having been monitored for years before their selection. Kess had records in her personal effects that showed inquisitorial surveillance dating back over a decade. Another psyker, Lexicanum Marcus Thorne, carried assignment documents that indicated his entire career had been manipulated to place him in positions where his psychic resonance could be properly evaluated. We weren't random selections. We were the product of a careful breeding and monitoring program that had been tracking us since childhood, waiting for us to reach optimal maturity before harvesting us for the Emperor's needs. Terra itself defied every description I had ever read. The cradle of humanity had become a world-sized shrine, its continents buried beneath layer upon layer of Gothic architecture that stretched from bedrock to the edge of space. The palace covered an area the size of continents, its spires disappearing into the clouds that wreathed the upper atmosphere. And at the center of it all, barely visible from our transport, but unmistakably present as a psychic beacon that could be felt across the entire system, rose the Sanctum Imperialis, the heart of the Imperial Palace where the God Emperor himself maintained his eternal watch. Even from orbit, the psychic presence of the Golden Throne was overwhelming. It felt like standing next to a star that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its influence extending not just through physical space, but through the warp itself. Every psyker aboard the Eternal Vigilance could feel it, a presence so vast and powerful that it made our own abilities seem like flickering candles in comparison. But there was something else in that presence, something that took me days to identify. Beneath the overwhelming power and divine authority was an undercurrent of suffering so profound that it made my soul ache just to perceive it. The Emperor wasn't just a beacon of psychic energy. He was a being in constant, unimaginable agony. And that agony was somehow integral to his function as humanity's protector. We were processed through a facility deep beneath the palace, in chambers carved from the living rock of Terra's ancient mountains. The facility was a masterwork of both engineering and occult science, its passages lined with materials that had been sanctified by 10,000 years of continuous prayer. Every surface was inscribed with protective wards and containment runes, creating an environment where even the most dangerous psychic phenomena could be safely contained and studied. Tech priests cataloged every aspect of our being with an attention to detail that went far beyond standard Imperial procedure. They took genetic samples, neural fluid samples, psychic resonance readings, and detailed measurements of our physical dimensions. They performed psychic probings that left me feeling violated in ways I couldn't articulate, their mental intrusions mapping not just the structure of my abilities, but the deepest levels of my personality and identity. Through it all, they maintained the fiction that we were being prepared for some great honor. The processing facility was decorated with murals depicting the Emperor's greatest triumphs, while servo skulls played hymns of devotion that reinforced the sacred nature of our supposed mission. The tech priests who examined us spoke in reverent tones about our upcoming sacred duty and the blessed transformation that awaited us. But it was the other sounds that truly revealed our situation. At night, when the facility's activities quieted, You could hear them if you pressed your ear to the ventilation grates. Screams, thousands upon thousands of human voices raised in agony so pure and sustained that it seemed to penetrate through multiple layers of reinforced adamantium. And beneath those screams, barely audible but unmistakably present, was a sound like vast machinery consuming something precious and irreplaceable. The screams had a rhythm to them, a cadence that suggested they weren't random expressions of pain but part of some larger, coordinated process. They rose and fell in waves, sometimes building to crescendos that made the entire facility vibrate with sympathetic resonance, other times fading to whispers that were somehow even more disturbing than the loudest wails. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the screams never stopped. They continued day and night, a constant background chorus of suffering that permeated every level of the facility. Whatever was producing those sounds had been going on for a very long time and showed no signs of ending. The truth began to emerge during what they called the conditioning phase. We were introduced to our new quarters, cells barely large enough to contain a bed and basic sanitation facilities, their walls inscribed with psychic dampening runes that made accessing our abilities impossible. The tech priests explained that this was necessary preparation for our sacred duty, that we needed to achieve perfect spiritual purity before we could serve the Emperor directly. The conditioning process involved daily sessions with Mechanicus interrogators who claimed to be evaluating our spiritual fitness for service. These sessions quickly revealed themselves to be something far more sinister. Detailed psychological examinations designed to map our mental responses to stress, pain, and fear. The interrogators would subject us to increasingly intense stimuli while monitoring our brain activity with sophisticated cogitator arrays, building detailed profiles of how our consciousness would react under extreme duress. They tested our pain thresholds using neural stimulators that could induce agony without causing physical damage. They evaluated our fear responses by showing us picked captures of previous volunteers undergoing procedures that were never fully explained but clearly involved extreme suffering. They measured our despair levels by gradually revealing the true nature of what awaited us, watching how our hope transformed into horror as the reality of our situation became clear. But the most disturbing aspect of the conditioning was how it was designed to maintain our psychological integrity even as it broke down our resistance. The interrogators weren't trying to destroy our minds. They were trying to prepare us to remain conscious and aware throughout whatever ordeal lay ahead. They wanted us to suffer completely, but they also needed us to maintain enough coherence to generate the specific type of psychic energy that the Emperor required. I learned the truth from sanctioned psyker Joanna Kess, a woman in her 30s who had served aboard Inquisitor Castigan's retinue for over a decade. Kess had been selected not for her psychic abilities, which were modest, but because she possessed detailed knowledge of heretical cults that the Inquisition wanted to extract before her termination. She had pieced together our actual purpose from conversations she had overheard between tech priests who assumed her loyalty implants prevented her from understanding the significance of their words. The Golden Throne, she explained in whispers barely audible above the ventilation systems, was not simply the life support system that kept the Emperor's physical form functional. It was a psychic amplification device of incomprehensible complexity, designed during the dark age of technology to channel and focus psychic energy on a scale that could affect the entire galaxy. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed Imperial ships to navigate the warps safely, required constant feeding to maintain its strength. Every day, 1,000 psychers were fed into the throne's mechanisms. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly. Their life force drained over hours while their souls were shredded and reformed into psychic energy that could be channeled through the Emperor's own consciousness. The process was designed to extract every possible joule of energy from each sacrifice, ensuring that nothing was wasted in humanity's desperate struggle for survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Kess told me about the selection criteria. We weren't chosen randomly, or even based purely on psychic strength. We were chosen because our psychic signatures indicated maximum compatibility with the throne's extraction mechanisms. Tests performed over 10 millennia had identified specific genetic markers and psychic resonance patterns that indicated a person would remain conscious throughout the entire draining process, experiencing every moment of their dissolution with perfect clarity. The Adeptus Mechanicus had discovered that conscious suffering generated more usable psychic energy than unconscious death. Every one of us in that facility had been specifically selected because we would feel every second of what was going to happen to us. Sleep became impossible after that conversation. How do you rest, knowing that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, tech priests will come to escort you to the most agonizing death imaginable? How do you maintain sanity when you understand that your screams will join the chorus of 10 million souls who have suffered the same fate over the past 10,000 years? Some of my fellow prisoners tried to find comfort in faith. They recited the Imperial Creed, convinced themselves that their suffering would serve a greater purpose, that their agony would help preserve humanity against the darkness that threatened to consume it. Others attempted suicide, only to discover that every surface in our cells was equipped with medical sensors that could detect self-harm attempts and trigger immediate intervention by servo skulls equipped with Medicase equipment. I found myself caught between despair and a kind of philosophical detachment that probably indicated I was losing my sanity. The Emperor, I realized, was not the benevolent father figure described in Imperial propaganda. He was something far more complex and terrifying, a being so committed to humanity's survival that he was willing to consume 1,000 human souls every day for 10,000 years to maintain the infrastructure necessary for interstellar civilization. From his perspective, seated upon a throne that allowed him to perceive threats across the entire galaxy, our individual suffering was probably invisible. 1,000 deaths weighed against the survival of 1,000,000 worlds. The screams of psychers fed to his machinery balanced against the safe passage of merchant fleets that kept billions fed. The mathematics were undeniably sound, even if the human cost was incomprehensible. My turn came on a Tuesday. I had been in the facility for 6 weeks, watching as groups of prisoners were taken away each morning and never returned. The tech priests who came from my group, designation Batch 847, moved with the efficient grace of beings who had performed this task countless times. They spoke in binary cant as they attached neural inhibitor collars to our necks, reducing our consciousness to a dim awareness that made resistance impossible but left us fully capable of experiencing what was about to happen. The journey through the palace's deeper levels took hours, passing through corridors that had been carved from solid adamantium and decorated with murals depicting humanity's greatest triumphs. Scenes of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's battles against the forces of chaos, the founding of the Imperium. All rendered with such artistic skill that they seemed to move in the flickering light of torch sconces. I found myself wondering if the artists who had created these masterpieces had known they were decorating the path to humanity's greatest abattoir. The Golden Throne Chamber was indescribable. Imagine a space so vast that its ceiling disappears into darkness, filled with machinery that combines the aesthetic sensibilities of ancient Terra with technology that defies understanding. Golden conduits thick as maglev trains snake through the air, carrying energies that make reality ripple around them. Servo skulls the size of aircraft patrol the perimeter, their auger arrays scanning constantly for signs of malfunction or intrusion. And at the center of it all, seated upon a throne that incorporates elements of both advanced technology and archaic symbolism, was the God Emperor of mankind. I had seen picked captures of the Emperor, artistic representations in books and on cathedral windows, even psychic impressions transmitted by astropaths who claimed to have glimpsed him during their communications. None of them captured the reality. The being on the Golden Throne was simultaneously more and less than human. His physical form maintained by technologies that blurred the line between medical equipment and arcane machinery. But it was his psychic presence that truly defined him, a consciousness so vast and powerful that being in its proximity was like standing next to a star. For a moment, as we were herded toward the feeding chambers that surrounded the throne, I felt something that might have been communication, not words, but an overwhelming sense of acknowledgement. The Emperor was aware of us, of our fear, of what was about to happen. There was no apology in that awareness, no regret or compassion, but there was recognition. We were necessary. Our deaths would serve a purpose so important that our suffering became acceptable collateral damage. The feeding chambers were mechanical wombs designed to extract maximum psychic energy from their occupants. As the tech priests secured me within the writhing mass of cables and neural interfaces, I understood that I was experiencing something that connected me to every psyker who had served this function over the past 10 millennia. My fear, my pain, my desperation, all of it had been felt before by hundreds of thousands of souls who had died in identical chambers. The extraction process began slowly, with neural interfaces establishing connections to every major nerve cluster in my body. I could feel my psychic abilities being accessed directly, bypassing all the mental safeguards and conditioning that had been drilled into me during my training. It was like having my soul slowly peeled away in layers, each one carrying with it memories, emotions, and pieces of my fundamental identity. But I remained conscious throughout, just as the selection criteria had promised. I experienced every moment of my dissolution with perfect clarity, feeling my thoughts and memories being stripped away and converted into raw psychic energy. The pain was beyond description. Imagine having your skin flayed while your nerves are still active. Then multiply that sensation by every cell in your body and extend it to your consciousness itself. And yet, as the process continued, I began to understand something that neither the tech priests nor my fellow prisoners had anticipated. The extraction wasn't simply draining my life force, it was incorporating my consciousness into something larger. My screams joined the psychic chorus that powered the Astronomicon, but my awareness didn't simply disappear. It became part of a vast, collective consciousness that spanned the entire galaxy. I could suddenly perceive Imperial ships navigating the warp, guided by the beacon that my agony was helping to maintain. I could sense the desperate battles being fought on a million worlds where Imperial forces struggled against alien invaders and chaos cults. I could feel the prayers of billions of Imperial citizens, their faith directed toward the Emperor and transmitted through the psychic network that my death was strengthening. The horror of my situation didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified as I realized that every other consciousness that had been fed to the throne was still present, still experiencing the pain of dissolution while simultaneously serving as components in humanity's greatest psychic construct. We were the Emperor's choir, screaming in eternal agony while our combined voice guided mankind through the darkness between stars. But there was purpose in that agony. Every ship that reached its destination safely, every world that received the supplies necessary for survival, every victory won by Imperial forces guided by astropathic communications, all of it was made possible by our sacrifice. We were the foundation upon which human civilization rested, the hidden cost of mankind's expansion across the galaxy. Time became meaningless in that state. Seconds stretched into years, while decades compressed into moments. I experienced the perspectives of countless other souls who had undergone the same process, feeling their memories and personalities blending with my own until I could no longer distinguish where I ended and they began. We became something new, not individual consciousnesses, but facets of a larger entity dedicated to humanity's survival. And through it all, we remained aware of the Emperor's presence. Not the distant, godlike figure worshipped by Imperial citizens, but the being who had created this system and who sustained it through his own unimaginable suffering. We understood that he experienced every moment of our agony as if it were his own, that our pain was magnified and reflected through his consciousness until it became a symphony of torment that encompassed the entire galaxy. Yet he endured it, just as we endured it, because the alternative was humanity's extinction. The forces of chaos pressed against the barriers between reality and the warp, seeking any opportunity to pour through and consume the material universe. The Tyranid hive fleets approached from the galactic edge, driven by hunger that would not be satisfied until every world was stripped of life. The Orc wargs gathered strength, threatening to overwhelm Imperial defenses through sheer numbers and brutality. Against all of these threats, the Imperium maintained its precarious existence through systems like the one that had consumed me. Every day, 1,000 souls were sacrificed to maintain the psychic infrastructure that kept human civilization functional. Every day, the Emperor absorbed their pain and channeled their energy toward purposes that spanned millennia and encompassed the fate of the entire species. I began to understand why the Imperial Creed taught that life was suffering, and that suffering was service to the Emperor. It wasn't metaphorical, it was the literal foundation of Imperial society. Every citizen who lived a life of hardship and deprivation, every soldier who died in humanity's endless wars, every psyker who was fed to the Golden Throne, all of it served the greater purpose of survival in a galaxy that was actively hostile to human existence. The knowledge was liberating in its own horrific way. My death hadn't been meaningless. It had been the most meaningful thing I could possibly have done. By accepting my role as fuel for the Emperor's psychic beacon, I had become part of humanity's greatest achievement. My screams would guide ships safely through the warp for as long as the Imperium endured. But the knowledge was also damning, because I understood that this system could never end. Even if humanity achieved total victory over all external threats, the Golden Throne would still require its daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls. The infrastructure that kept the Imperium functional was built on suffering, and dismantling it would mean the collapse of human civilization across the galaxy. We were trapped in a cycle that had begun 10,000 years ago and would continue until the last human being drew their final breath. The Emperor's vision of humanity's destiny required this sacrifice, and so we would provide it, screaming and conscious and fully aware of the cost, because the alternative was extinction. As my individual consciousness finally dissolved completely into the larger psychic construct, I experienced something that might have been peace. Not the cessation of suffering that would continue for as long as the Astronomicon burned, but acceptance of my role in something infinitely larger than myself. I had become part of the Emperor's voice, speaking across the galaxy to guide humanity through the darkness. My name was Lexicanum Tertius Valdris, and I was sacrificed to the God Emperor of mankind. This is what it means to die for the Imperium, to become an eternal scream of agony that serves as humanity's lighthouse in an ocean of chaos. To understand that your suffering is necessary, meaningful, and unending, and to know that you would make the same choice again, because the alternative is the death of everything you ever loved. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also sacrifice and service, and the understanding that some prices are worth paying, no matter how terrible they might be. We are the 1,000 who die each day so that billions might live. We are the Emperor's eternal choir, singing humanity's song of survival in voices made of pain and purpose. We are the price of the light in the darkness, and we pay it gladly, because we understand what happens when the light goes out.